Okay, good afternoon or morning, as the case may be, British and American culture students. We are going to close out the 18th century, for the American side at least, will be, I know I said I divided this class into, the first half being British and the second half being American. It's not quite true because a lot of things continue to happen in British culture over the next 300 years, which we haven't talked about. So we will be kind of jumping back across the Atlantic. One of the reasons is because these two cultures diverge, but they do have the same origin, and a lot of the ideas and the politics and the conflicts that happen involve both of them. The Industrial Revolution is very important to the history of the world. The development of globalization, those were things that the British had only started to do at the time of the American Revolution. So we do have to go back sometimes. But today we're going to focus on what happens in America. The first thing I want to say is, remember, until the American Revolutionary War is over, these people are British, right? They don't start calling themselves American. Well, they start calling themselves Americans because they don't want to be called colonists because they're considered second-class citizens. But as I'll explain, they aren't second-class citizens. They start to develop a society a culture that is sort of a blend of American life environment and English society. So one student at the end of class came up to me and said, I want to know about, the slavery. And I said, well, that's the topic of the next lecture. I called this The Great Contradiction. That's kind of an ambiguous title on purpose, but what I really mean is the moral and ethical problem that slavery presented from the very beginning, and it's a problem that America still has to deal with today and hasn't dealt with completely. It's a legacy that continues to affect how people live and what opportunities people have in the United States. So talking about how it developed and whose fault it is and so on, a lot of people there's a lot of different opinions. So I'm going to present to you some perspective. I'm going to present to you some facts and some ideas, and you can come to your own conclusions. But the bottom line is that it is the single most disgraceful. I think the single most, along with the treatment of the Native people, is the greatest moral negative aspect of American history and American culture. I'm Canadian, and so we have some people, because America is much bigger and is more famous, people don't realize that Canada has a similar history of discrimination and exploitation of Native people and of people from Africa. We're in no way innocent, and we had the same sort of programs. So I'll try to give you a perspective, and it's not going to be a positive one for the most part, but I'm going to try and present it in as neutral a way as possible so that you can get the most out of this lecture. There's nobody in this class, I don't think, who is of African descent. We have people from Asia and Europe and North America. Sometimes I've had South Americans. Some people may have ancestors that came from Africa. So in speaking about this to you, I'll try and be as sensitive as possible to the treatment of the people who are your ancestors. So let's talk about this. It's only at the end of chapter 4. Let's see here. That I actually start talking about slavery after, in the book, I start talking about after the American Revolution, which that's a mistake. There are a lot of things that need to be improved in this book. It's the third edition, so you'd think I'd have most of it figured out. But as I said, it's a big topic, and to figure out what things to emphasize and what things need to be taught to the students and how it needs to be taught takes a long time. So I've done this course for about 8 years and 3 editions of a textbook. And what I've written on the board, for the most part, isn't in the textbook, because there's only a couple pages about this, but it deserves a lot more. So in the next edition, this material will be in the textbook. I've said that quite a few times this semester, so remember, make sure you read the stuff in the textbook. Sometimes the textbook expands on what I say in lecture, but in this case, the lecture is going to expand on the 2 pages that are in the book, okay? So make sure you pay attention. As you can see, I've written a lot on the board. I've got a blue marker here, and I'm going to try and highlight. This is the way I lecture anyway, so the board gets kind of mixed up. I start in the middle, and then I start writing things on the edges. So as you go, I suggest you write down some notes about the important things that I say, okay? So basically, we have a quiz next Friday. I'm going to post this lecture today. As soon as it gets uploaded, I'll link it so that you have 5 days to watch this before we do the quiz. The quiz will be in class, but you have to, we're going to do it on Google Forms, but you have to come to class. So you have to be in class by 11 o'clock, sitting at your desk with all your stuff away, except for your laptop connected to Wi-Fi, your tablet, or your phone. That's what we voted. We're working on democratic ideas for the rest of the class here. It's going to be in the background all the time. So we elected to do that by majority vote. I don't think there was any dissenters. So we're doing the Google Forms quiz, but not on Wednesday, Friday at 11 o'clock sharp. Okay, so bring your device, make sure it's charged, and sit by yourself, and we'll get that out of the way, paperless quiz, and then we'll move on to the next topic, which is the 19th century America and Industrial Revolution. So go back in time. Like I said, unlike for most of the class, I've been going forward in time, but as you've seen already, we've gone back to Columbus and then forward to the Revolution, and we've gone back again to see the development of the colonies, and then forward to George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. And for the 3rd time today, we're going to go back. So the period we're talking about is the same period, and this 3 times already during the American part. We've gone from Columbus forward in exploration to the American Revolution, and then we've talked about the colonies, protesting and stuff going forward. Now we're going to go right back to when Jamestown was founded and the Virginia colony started. Within about 20 years, all those northeastern New England colonies, Massachusetts and New Jersey and New York, they're all founded. As I pointed out before, Delaware was actually a Swedish colony, and New York was actually New Amsterdam, a Dutch colony. But we already talked about that. The main object for people to go to America from England, from Britain, first from England, but then the Scots and the Irish start joining them, and eventually Germans and Swedes and Dutch and other people start immigrating as well. One of the reasons is the population is starting to recover from the Black Death. As somebody wrote on their midterm, they remembered me saying, I don't think it's in the textbook, they remembered from lecture me saying, the Middle Ages was the golden age of labor. Almost everybody had a job. But because of various economic factors, which I won't go into in detail, but one major factor is just enough goods had been produced, and it's not a material culture where you just like wear a coat for 1 year and then you don't like it, the style of it, so next year you get a new one. That's not how the economy worked. That's not how the culture worked. Some people had one pair of shoes for their whole life and they repaired them, right? So you'd have like 2 pairs of clothes. Those of you who have like 50 pairs of clothes, you would have been a very rich person in the Middle Ages. If you had 50 sets of clothes, you would have been upper class, a baron or a duke or a duchess. or a princess or something like that. The average person had 1 or 2 pairs of clothes that they had to wash all the time, and their shoes, they wore them till they worn out, and then they got them repaired. If you got a brand new pair of shoes, every couple weeks, then you're probably a king. So this is a totally different environment. Inflation isn't a thing. Prices don't fluctuate. As we get into, as we talked about the British, as we get into the period that Great Britain exists, the commercial revolution and the financial revolution, companies, venture companies, corporations banks start lending money and all that kind of stuff. There's more capital moving around. There's more purchasing. People want luxuries. This is modern. So this is more familiar to us. You got to remember, at this time though, we're in a transition. Right? We know now, and I'm going to talk about this in the Industrial Revolution section, we know now that our obsession with consumption, with throwing things away, is actually destroying the earth. But we have the option of doing that because our economy and our industry and our productivity is so developed. But they actually didn't have the materials, productivity, or the money, even if they wanted to have more. So people don't have jobs. There's a socialist in the beginning of the 18th century, late 17th century. I can't remember his name. He's not a socialist. He's a social studies, a person who studies. He's more of a social scientist, like a statistician. And he looks at the population in England and he says, well, there's roughly like 2.6 million English people who are being productive or adding value to the economy through their labor or through their wealth. And he estimated there was about 2.8 who were not, right? So half the population is not being productive in an economic sense, right? I'm not talking about whether they were good people or bad people. I'm just talking about if they produced things and that were exchanged and traded and added value to the economy. Half the country was not. And why was that? And who are these people? Well, the government thought that this was their fault. They thought that these people were lazy, or they were unmotivated, lazy, or cheaters, or various things, right? They had no ability. They were stupid. They thought it was their fault. Basically, there was various reasons they thought, for the reason that they were unemployed and unable to produce stuff and unable to support themselves. And this is not a welfare state. As we said, the monasteries are gone. We got rid of the Catholic Church that used to, actually value the poor and think blessed are the poor and we should help them. That society has been destroyed. So moving into the 17th century, the Protestant society believes in hard work. And if you don't have a job and you don't work hard and you don't do anything, it's your fault. So what should the government do about that? Well, this is when they made the Poor Law, and they used to send people off to these workhouses, which were basically factories where if you're poor, you went there, you got paid a low wage, and you lived in like a workhouse dormitory kind of thing. And they put all the unworthy, right? There's the two types of poor. Like if you're sick or you're a child or something like that, then you don't have to go to a workhouse. But there's the able and the disabled poor, basically. So if you're in a category where you can't work, then you don't have to go to the workhouse. But anybody who looks like they're capable of working, has the physical and mental capacity, they get sent there. And as you can imagine, putting all the poor, uneducated people who maybe are less motivated or maybe just can't find work, but putting all of them in the same area is essentially like making a ghetto, or making like a part of a city which is a poor, decaying urban area. So it doesn't help. It actually makes the problem worse, because how are you going to get out of the poorhouse? You're probably going to go there and live with other poor people and work really hard to make just enough to have some clothes and have a small room for yourself and something to eat. And that's it. So the other solution to all these people, I have a list of them here, different types of people. These are we call them the Pilgrims, which is an ironic name because really only the Puritans who went to Massachusetts were pilgrims. They were religious people going on a religious journey, going to the promised place, which turned out to be Boston and Plymouth. But let's say, quote unquote, the Pilgrims, all the people that are going, they're immigrants, they're emigrating from the English. These are all the people that ended up over there. Vagrants are just wandering people. Vagrants, dissenters, people who won't follow the Church of England. Recluses, people who don't, they isolate themselves, they stay away from society. The debased, right? They've hard luck, right? Convicts, so they're criminals. They've done some sort of civil or criminal offense, so they're in jail. Idealists, people who don't like English society. Unemployed, homeless, unskilled, dispirited, people who just feel like their life sucks. Prisoners of war. You see the list there of people. Now, this highlights what I wrote here is the colonists, other than perhaps Massachusetts, which even there, you look at, they're basically Puritans, they're faithful people, and they're going there for religious reasons. They go there to be free from England, but also free to make rules for their own society so that they can make a Puritan, colony. Even there, you end up finding people like this. They're not really going there because they're Puritan. They're going there because they have other problems, economic problems, social problems, mental problems, legal problems. All of these people are basically not normal, not the average successful English person. But like I said, just remember that social scientists said half of England is this. So they have a huge problem and they don't know what to do with it. So they build these workhouses, they make the poor law, they say the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, right? The undeserving poor, you go to the workhouse or you get out of the country, you get on a boat, right? The deserving poor are the old, the infirm, like the sick, right? Physically handicapped or sick, old people and children, young children. Once you're 10 years old in 17th century, you're not a kid anymore and you go to the workhouse. So this is what happens. They start putting them on ships and the kings and queens, they don't want to deal with this problem, right? They want it to go away. In some ways, they probably wished the Catholic Church was still around to take care of all the poor people because now it's all on them. They got to do something with all these people wandering around London, these out-of-work farmers and poor people coming to London and looking for work, and there isn't any, right? There's a myth that in London anybody can find a job, but it's all the jobs are taken. And if you come and you're just a laborer, you can't just become a blacksmith or a metalsmith or a jeweler or a tailor because you don't know how to do it. Like you'd have to train for a while, maybe a few years before you would be able to do some work. Nobody wants somebody who can just lift bricks or dig holes. That's an unskilled laborer. However, the thing is, in the colonies, as I said, we will come back, we'll go back in time again, and probably several more times, but at least one more time, we'll go back in time to talk about the native people, the tribes, the Iroquois, the Algonquin, the Arawak, the Cree. There's many tribes. I don't expect you to remember them all, but we call them Native American as a group. But you have to know there are hundreds of them. And if you talk to a Native person, it would be polite to inquire, which particular tribe they belong to, because there are a lot of them. As I said, we don't know how many people, 50 million people in the Americas, maybe more, but that population completely collapsed. So as a result, there's a lot of land in America and not very many people. There's a lot of land, not very many people. England has the opposite problem. Now the population is starting to recover from the Black Death. Remember, in the 13th century, there was, because of the good weather for several hundred years and because of harvests and good health, there was a sort of overpopulation, and then bad weather and the Black Death caused a population collapse in Europe. So now the population, though, is going through Elizabethan times into the 17th century. The population is recovering. And now it's getting to the point where there's too many people in England and not enough land. So if you have land in England, you're rich, right? That's it. All the wealthy people have land. Land is the most valuable thing in England. In America, in some sense, land is free in many cases. I mean, some of it belongs to the native people, but it's not, as I said, it's been depopulated to the extent that it doesn't look like it belongs to anybody. There may have been, 12 villages in an area, and now there's only 2, and the populations are small. So it looks like this land is all available. So if you're any one of these people, what you do is rather than going to a workhouse, you might decide to offer your labor to somebody who has land in America, and they would pay. Even William Penn, the Quaker, who was trying to make the Brotherhood of Jesus and a community of brotherhood of equals and friends, even he paid, the king or paid jails or paid institutions or paid workhouses money to put these people on ships, send them over to America, right? And then they were on contract for, let's say, 5 years, right? You could commute your sentence. If you were a convict, if you were in jail and you're in prison for a crime, you could commute your sentence. If you were in jail for 5 years, you could go to America and work for a master, for a landowner, for 5 years to finish your sentence, because the jails were full too. I mean, it costs money to keep people alive in jail and to have paid guards and everything. So having prisons that are overflowing were bad for the government too. So they're solving all these problems just by sending all these people that don't fit into society, and solving the overpopulation problem too by sending them all over to America. So you can imagine, I already explained to you, we talked about all the different, there's 13 colonies, and they have different religions, and they have different lifestyles, and they have different backgrounds, and some of them come from different countries. And how could these colonies possibly have started to, form one country? It doesn't look like, one student said, it looks more like they would fight each other rather than band together and then have a war against the mother country. It looks more like Maryland would fight with Massachusetts, because Maryland started as a Catholic colony and Massachusetts is Puritan, right? And Georgia is supposed to be a country of free citizens who are equals, and just on the other side, just north of them, is North Carolina and South Carolina, which are slave states. And you would think that they would be at odds and might have political and military conflicts, but their differences are obvious. At the beginning, until the 1700s, they all developed their own distinct characters. But as they develop, because there's no plan. This is what I said before. Remember, this might be a better word. I'll use both on the quiz, but salutary is not a word that people use very often anymore. So sometimes professors, scholars say benign, because benign means not bad, like benevolent, positive, right? Benign means it's not malevolent, is the opposite of it, which means evil or aggressive. For example, we say benign cancer means it's a tumor, it can be removed. Malignant cancer is the dangerous kind that's going to spread and try to kill you. So benign neglect means we're leaving you alone as a good thing, right? Because they have their hands full. As I said, in the 1640s, there's a civil war. They have a Puritan revolution. Cromwell's the Lord Protector for a while. Then they have a restoration. Then they have a Catholic king, and they get rid of him, and they invite a foreign, you know the story. The 17th century, it's a mess in England. So the kings and queens are not really focused on this, constant flow of people going out. In fact, they think it's a good thing. Get these people out of England, and if they form their own societies, and they don't cause any trouble, as long as they behave themselves, then just let them do what they want. That's what benign neglect is, right? So but they're not normal, average English citizens. They're not ideal citizens in any way. So it's all kind of disordered, disorganized, disoriented. You can imagine you're in England and you're in like an urban setting, or you're in a jail or something, and you get on a boat and you take a couple months, and then you get off the boat and like you're in the middle of nowhere. There's a bunch of mountains and forests and rivers, and there's native people and some, colonists and, construction going on and stuff. It would be a big shock. It would be a much bigger shock than going from, Canada to Korea, or Germany to Korea, or Korea even to an African country today. It would be even more of a shock. You would just be not sure what to do, especially because, as I emphasized, these people are not skilled laborers. Sometimes they're wealthy, but that's a very small percentage. Most of them don't really have, they have their labor, they have their strength, but they don't have any particular skills. And so they have to, work hard for a master for a certain period, 5, 7, 10 years. And when the contract is over, then they can look for their own property. And as I said, it's basically the land is pretty much free, even though it actually belongs to the native people. They take it anyway as if it's free. So as this happens, at first, it doesn't grow very fast because there's a lot of native tribes that fight against them and try and stop them. But as the population increases and the death rate, because at first the death rate is crazy. In Virginia, 50% of the people that arrive will die within several years. So this actually works out in favor of the landlords, because they get a person to come over for on contract. They pay for them to come. The labor is free for 7 years, right? And then they die after 5 years. That sounds like it would be bad, but if they finish their contract, they're free people. They're free British citizens. They can go over the hill and start their own farm. They can start their own tobacco plantation, and then they can import their own indentured servants, convicts, beggars or unemployed people, and then they will become competition for you. So in the beginning, although lots of planters, although lots of masters died too, the high death rate actually made the contract system work very well. So there wasn't so much slavery, like as we would think of it, like permanent slavery and enslavement of other people from other races. That was not very common. But as the population started to grow, the death rate went down. The native people started to be pushed back away from the edges of the colonies. And this development and surprisingly stability, trade and roads and ships started passing in between the colonies. Then these contracts started to become a problem because people would survive. People would come over, do their 5 years or 7 years, and then they would be done. And then they would want their land. In some cases, that was part of the deal. If you finish your 7 years, then you get, 40 acres of land to yourself when you're done. But the land started to get all occupied. The property, had reached its extent all the way up the rivers in Virginia. It got to the point where there wasn't good land left in the area where the colony was located. This is especially Virginia, but it happened in all the colonies. Virginia, I'm just going to focus on Virginia as the biggest and most developed example of what was happening. Slavery in the North basically never got popular. That's one of the reasons the Civil War happened between the North and the South, because there was slavery in the North, but it wasn't really hard laboring type of slavery. The slave might be a servant in the house, or they might work on the farm, but it wasn't back-breaking labor like picking cotton, processing cotton, planting sugar in the blazing heat with diseases, right? You don't have the same kind of diseases in northern United States that you would in the South. just like the farther you get south into the jungles, the more the diseases are lethal and dangerous. So slavery in the South, even though there was slavery in the North, it was much smaller, and the type of labor was different. In the South, there were giant plantations being formed. Tobacco in Virginia and south of Virginia, where cotton started to grow, cotton would supersede tobacco as the most important product in the United States, because cotton was the material that drove the Industrial Revolution, and tobacco was more of a luxury item. So in the beginning, though, tobacco was the product, and that was the thing that made people rich. So they imported as many convicts. They made as many contracted laborers, people who would sell their labor. Even if you weren't a criminal, even if you weren't a convict, if you had no job and you had no future, and you're on the street, you might decide to sign a contract. This is called an indentured servant, right? You would say, okay, I can't find a job anywhere, so I'm gonna sell my labor for 5 years to a plantation owner, and then get on the ship. The plantation owner would pay for you to come across, and then you would work for the person for 5 years. And when you were done, you would be free. And then you would be able to start over, right? This is the land of opportunity, but you had to pay for it somehow. So if you had no money, you had no future, you had no connections, you couldn't borrow anything, the only way you could get over there was for somebody to ship you over there and you to offer yourself as a contracted laborer. It's not the same as slavery, but you couldn't run away. You had to work, right? And you weren't working for money. You were working for freedom. So it is a kind of slavery, but not the same as what develops afterwards. I want to make that very clear. So let's just say one more thing. As this happens, there is something in Virginia that's called Bacon's Rebellion. And this is kind of the trigger point for the Virginian planters thinking, okay, we've got too many of these English, Irish, and Scottish contracted laborers, and when their contracts are done, they're gonna make trouble. The first thing they do is they say, okay, you can only vote, and they have their own little legislature, right? These idealists, they want to have a parliament of their own. They can't, they're not supposed to, it's illegal, right? But they have a governor from Britain, and the governor doesn't do anything, and the king and queen don't do anything for a long time, until it's too late. So they have this thing called the Burgess, and the elected people, they have elections, and three or four times a year, they make these bills, they make these laws, and that's it. It's kind of off the radar with the British Parliament and the government because they don't do it very often. Like 3 or 4 times they get together and they do some political stuff and they stamp it and they make it into law, but it's actually not binding law, but everybody follows it anyway. So they're creating these little mini parliaments, in particular in Virginia. And in Virginia, this group called the Burgess is basically wealthy people, and they decide that you're only allowed to vote if you have property. Okay, so that immediately excludes all the workers. Nobody's allowed to vote who's a indentured servant, contracted laborer, anybody who comes over and doesn't have their own land, anybody who's not a wealthy person is not allowed to vote. Okay, so all right, fine. Then they decide, the governor, this guy's named Barclay, but doesn't matter, he builds forts at the headwaters of the Virginia rivers. So this is the river, like the mouth of the river is at the ocean, and you go up the river into America, and he's building these forts there to put soldiers there. This is supposed to be to protect them from the native people. But actually, the real reason is, as I said before, the British in 1763, they're gonna make a Royal Proclamation Act that says you cannot go west and you cannot infringe on native people's land. That's the line, right? What you saw on the map, that was the edge. And this is what Governor Barclay tries to do. He tries to build forts so that he can protect the settlements, Jamestown, from the natives, but actually he's trying to keep the settlers from expanding west and fighting the natives. It's not the natives really that are causing the problem. It's the fact that the Virginians and other Carolinians and Virginians and other colonists, British colonists, are moving west too far. And that causes the natives to fight back. So if they can block them, then there won't be any, violence between the colonists and the natives. But of course, all the people, all the convicts who came over to work for 7 years and then get free land afterwards, they don't like it. So there's a rebellion. They get a bunch of, the guy, it's called Bacon's Rebellion because the guy's name is Bacon, and they get together a whole bunch of, this is very traditionally American, as you can see, that they still do this kind of stuff. They get all their guns together, and then they go and they take Jamestown, and the governor runs away. This is why, by the way, January 6th was so scary, is because this kind of thing has happened many times in American history. So American politicians who are smart and know their history don't think this is a joke that Donald Trump said maybe you should fight and don't agree with the election results and protest, and maybe we should take Capitol Hill, and made all these suggestions, and then they did it. That's because this has happened. There's been many rebellions, Americans against British and then Americans against themselves. So this kind of insurrection or rebellion happens frequently. This one happens, Virginians against themselves. The British governor runs away. Bacon, luckily for the British, dies, and the rebellion falls apart. But they learn their lesson that having too many of these people who are laborers and are free, right? They don't have enough people in America. They don't have enough, and they can't afford to pay enough money, right? These master planters, these plantation owners, these wealthy people, they have a lot of money, but they don't have enough money to pay maybe in some cases 100 people to harvest the tobacco. They don't have enough money to do that. So if they try, they'll probably end up in jail because they'll run out of money, and then the people they borrow money from, they will, sue them in court. And what happened in the 1700s and 18th century and 17th century is if you couldn't pay back, they put you in jail until you could pay back. But the problem is, if you owe money and they put you in jail, how are you supposed to make money to pay back your debt? You're kind of stuck in debt. You're probably stuck in debt and then therefore in prison forever, and unless your rich uncle or aunt bails you out. So they start to look at other options. And the obvious option was slavery. And the slave trade had already been established. And people have to realize, what I want you to realize is, slave societies have existed throughout human history. In ancient times, when an army conquered another kingdom, frequently there were people following the army to enslave the citizens of the country, right? The Romans used to send armies around Europe, and there used to be people behind them, merchants and slave traders, and attendants and carts and traders. They used to have all kinds of people following the army, and that was part of the thing. Julius Caesar went to France, which was called Gaul. He killed thousands and thousands of Gaul warriors. And when he did, he took control of territory, and they went to villages and they enslaved the remaining men and women and children, and they sold them. He brought back hundreds of thousands of slaves, Gaulish slaves, to Rome, and that made him incredibly rich. Eventually, there was many rebellions in Rome, including the famous social war, and Spartacus, the movie Spartacus, if you know who that is. It's all about a gladiator who leads a gigantic army of slaves, gladiator slaves and other slaves, in a revolt in Rome. The Ottoman Empire, the Arab, the Islamic Empire, the Arab, they all had slaves, right? All of them had slaves. One of the sources of slaves, the biggest sources of slaves, before this and through this period we're talking about, was Africa, right? Portuguese and Spanish people had discovered that they could go down around down from Spain and Portugal around Africa. They had been raiding the West African coast for well over 100 years. They had established a slave trade. The biggest slave trade was the Portuguese. Where's my numbers here? In the book, it says the same thing. 10 to 12 million people ended up being taken captive. 40% of them by the Portuguese. And the Portuguese transported about 75% of them, and 40% of them. That's one of the reasons why you see so many dark-skinned Brazilians, is because there were millions of African people, and they mixed. A lot of them mixed. So there's a lot of Brazilians who have African, native, Portuguese, and Spanish blood. They're all mixed together. Colombia, Venezuela as well. We won't talk about that in detail because we're running out of time, but 40% of them went to Brazil. The French, Spanish, and English and Dutch accounted for the other half, and only about 10%. And I say only about 10%, but 10% is still a huge number. We're still talking about over 1 million being moved from Africa to America, right? North America, being, from Florida up to Canada, okay? So about 1 million people, probably maybe even as many as 2 million, but it's a small proportion of the notorious triangle trade with the Middle Passage, right? The triangle trade is the cotton goes up to Liverpool and Bristol and the other ports of England, and they get manufactured goods and cloth and stuff, and they go down to West Africa, and then they trade those goods for people. For West Africans, sometimes prisoners of war, sometimes they fight and capture people themselves, but often they're already captives or prisoners of war who have lost against another tribe. And that tribe sells them for weapons and for goods manufactured in Europe. They sell the people, and then they go across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, mostly, for sugar plantations, and there's coffee and indigo and cotton and tobacco, but most of them go to the Caribbean, then they go to South America, and some of them are diverted to the Carolinas, Georgia, and the southern United States, Virginia, okay? That's called the triangle trade, and one of the biggest crimes against humanity, but not the first or the last, but one of the worst that Europeans have committed, certainly against if you're going to talk about continents doing things to other continents, I suppose, as a group, Europeans, one of including the Americans and the Canadians who are descended from Europeans, one of the worst things that they have done to Africa, but not the only thing. But this system already existed. We'll have to establish that. The Americans, the Portuguese and Spanish had already created this slave labor transportation trading system, and the English joined it and took advantage of it. Northern African tribes who were powerful, and Arabs who were powerful, were already trading slaves. Many, many millions of slaves went the other way. African slaves went to the Middle East, and African slaves went all the way as far as India and Pakistan. So this disadvantage Africa had of conflict within its own tribes and technologically superior empires surrounding it, capturing and displacing some of its best people, some of its strongest individuals, is a part of the tragedy of the reality that Africa experiences now. This is not a short story. This is hundreds of years of Africa being exploited, right? And then when those people were displaced, removed, captured, forced to move to America, then they became slaves for life. They changed the system. Another reason this was attractive was because if the death rate was low, African people generally were strong and had more resistance to heat and more resistance to disease. They could work hard, and they could work, and they would survive their entire life, perhaps. Even if they worked really hard, they were tough, and they were superior in many ways as workers to the native people who could get disease easier. They were used to the climate, of course, but they weren't used to sort of the kind of like organized agricultural system. Africa had this. Like Africa had, agriculture, and they had their villages, and they had slaves. Africans enslaved each other. They had these systems, and they were used to it. And to some degree, the native people just mentally and spiritually, physically were less able to handle the incredible suffering that a slave would have to endure. Then, of course, if a native person escaped, they could run back to their tribe, and even though they branded you, there would be a chance that they could blend in and disappear and get away. Same thing with an Anglo-Saxon, Irish, or Scottish, or German slave. You could brand them with a scar or something, but all they would have to do is run away to another town in New England, get their hair cut, and then wear a shirt covering the brand or something like that, or a high collar, and lay low, and it would be very difficult for the master to track them down. In the case of the African people, it was very easy to tell. If you were a black person, if you had dark skin and you couldn't speak English or any other European language, you spoke an African language and you had dark skin, you were not a free person. So it was a way of color coding slavery. That's how it started to develop. Virginia made it for political and economic reasons, not for moral reasons, but eventually, as the population grew, by the time the revolution comes around, right, there are hundreds of thousands of black people, African, now they're African Americans, African slaves. They don't have citizenship or anything. They're not given them because slaves actually, they have no rights, right? So this is what happens. Around 1750, the labor that's cheap, the labor is not cheap anymore. It becomes more and more expensive. The crown in England, actually, the colonies start exporting, and the trade balance between the United Kingdom and the colonies starts to grow in the favor of the colonies. The colonies are making more money, or exporting more things to the United Kingdom than the United Kingdom is exporting to them. So they don't really want to send more workers, because that would just help their economy get bigger. So they're not going to help sink their own trade balance. So the government's not going to help them. So what are the colonies going to do about this? This is one of the reasons they turned to slavery. As I mentioned, the other reason, the death rates, the color coding, how the black people are better laborers overall. And they decide, when they make them slaves, that they're going to be the worst kind of slavery, because there's many types of slavery. Some of the people that went to Portugal, or went to the Ottoman Empire, or went to Saudi Arabia, or went to Iran, Persia, some of those slaves would have just been house slaves, right? They would have been servants, and they would have just served people in the household. But this is different. This is what you call chattel slavery, which is, in a sense, the worst kind. It's like, it's chaining people to work. It's watching them and punishing them like they're animals, that they're not humans. So when they arrive, when they get off the ship and they are sort of chained up and brought to their plantation where they're going to work for a master, that this is a social death. They have no rights. They can't get married, right? They can't get, when somebody hurts them physically, they have no rights to a lawyer. They have no rights of protection of their health or their family or their friends or their possessions. They're just property. They're just a machine. And this is the part that is so terrible about this whole story, is that they because of the economic advantage, they do away with all of the idealism, all of the morality, all of the ethics, all of the things that Europeans want for themselves. They take away from the slaves, right? This is the tragedy of the whole thing. So in the end, there's more and more people, and there's such a demand for African people that the number of African Americans they're Africans, the number of Africans, the number of Black people moving across to the colonies outnumbers the number of white people during the period from about the late 17th century, the late 1600s, until all the way until the American Civil War. The population of African people, the number of immigrants is higher than white people. So you can see by doing that, they start to need some other reasons to justify what they're doing. So this is where the division by race and racism begins, right? It begins before the Revolution. And as I said, Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. George Washington was a slave owner. When George Washington died, he freed all his slaves, right? But what are they supposed to do? It's nice, George, that you freed your slaves when you died because you didn't need them anymore, because you didn't need the money because you're dead. No offense to everybody who loves George Washington, but there's only so much good you can do when you've used them for your own purpose and you're trying to alleviate your guilt by some people say, well, he wasn't really a racist, or he wasn't really in favor of slavery, because look at, in his will, he let all of his slaves go, hundreds of them, he let them go. But what did they do after that? Nobody was going to give them a job. Everybody else still has slaves. It's still a slave society. So 400 freemen, where are they going to go? What are they going to do? They're in Virginia. It's a slave society. They're going to be discriminated against. They might even get physically or abused, or people might be violent to them. They probably tried to get away to the north, to Connecticut or Massachusetts or another state that was going to abolish slavery soon. But it really isn't as generous as you think, because just letting a slave go who has no skills and is going to be racially profiled and discriminated against physically and socially and legally isn't really putting them in a good position to have a good life as a free person. They still probably feel like they're not free to do anything. That's not real freedom, okay? So, I talked about the good points about George Washington, but underlying the American society, the Great Contradiction is all this, all men are created equal. What about women? What about people with no property? What about slaves? What about Native people? So this rhetoric that is so important and so respected, the Declaration of Independence, really rings hollow. And inevitably, I think, the American Civil War will occur over the contradiction between the reality of the life of unfree people and a country that's based on freedom. So that is my lecture. That's one of the hardest lectures to teach. And I hope this helped you understand how it developed. But in the end, as the American Revolution happens, they come face to face with the economic and political and moral reality that they have a slave society, and some of the people are so invested in it that they start to make reasons. They start to justify their actions by saying, well, white people are better than black people, and they're better than Native people, and this is the racist white supremacist myth that some people created, argued as an excuse to maintain their power, to maintain their wealth, and to keep their slave society going. And when we go into the Civil War, you'll hear the same kind of thing. Well, this is about states' rights. This is about each state being able to make its own decisions and determine its own future. But what is it what's the issue? The issue is you want to keep slavery. It's not about states' rights. It's about maintaining an unfair, unequal slave society in order to preserve your social and economic structure. But that's a topic for another day. So that's the lecture on the Great Contradiction of America, slavery. We'll continue to discuss this as we go into the American Civil War. Thank you for listening. I know this was a long one, so maybe listen to it in chunks, make some notes. Freeze frame. Freeze frame. There's a lot of stuff on the board, but hopefully you followed what I said. That's the main points have all been covered. So that's going to be half the quiz is going to be about slavery, and the rest of it will be about the founding fathers, the American Revolution, the reasons for the political division between the colonies and the British Empire, and of course, don't forget, we started with Columbus discovering the New World. Okay, thank you everybody for enduring the long lecture. I'll see you on Friday for quiz number 4. Have a good weekend.